Merhaba, SabancıDx'in YouTube kanalından yayınlanan Digital Minds Programına hoş geldiniz. Digital Minds'ta The Day After Tomorrow temasıyla geleceğin teknolojilerini konuşuyoruz. Dijital dönüşüm konularını kendi alanlarında uzman uluslararası isimlerden dinliyoruz. Bu bölümdeki konumuz yapay zeka etiği. Başvurduğumuz isim ise dünyaya teknoloji, sosyoloji, ekonomi gibi alanlarda ışık tutan, yön veren önemli kurumlardan bir tanesi olarak bilinen Dünya Ekonomik Forumu'nun Yapay Zeka ve Makine Öğrenmesi Bölümü Başkanı Kay Firth-Butterfield. İngiliz bir hukukçu olan Firth-Butterfield, SabancıDx'e yapay zeka etiğini gözeterek bir ülkenin ulusal stratejisi nasıl oluşturulması gerektiğini, bir şirketin ise nasıl bir yol haritası çizmesi gerektiğini anlattı. Welcome to the Digital Minds, Kay Firth-Butterfield from the World Economic Forum, right? And you are the head of AI and machine learning. So this is a very unique position as an academician, as a lawyer for you, and as a woman as well, because you're not only into the ethics part of the issue, but also business-wise and production-wise. You're just dealing with all the aspects of the issue. So shall we start from the business-wise first? I mean, from the global perspective, how does especially big companies use AI, and where are we at right now?
Certainly. Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. And it's a pleasure to talk about this. So what I actually do is I lead work around the governance of artificial intelligence. And we do that in what we would call a multi-stakeholder way. So working with countries, businesses, academia, and civil society. And whether we're working specifically on a project with a country or countries, we still bring together that multi-stakeholder group. You asked me specifically about business. Well, it's very interesting because in 2019, we began to see tech clash around AI. And if you look at PwC's predictions for 2019, they believed that about 20% of companies would deploy AI across the whole of their company. But by the time we got to January 2020, when they did their next set of predictions, they had reduced that figure to 4%. So I think it's interesting to see what's going on there, and obviously that was pre-COVID. I think that it was partly because we were beginning to see tech clash and companies were being more cautious, and rightly so, about the use of AI and thinking about through the ethical issues. And so perhaps not moving from POC to actual full-fledged work. I think it's also that as the AI ethics conversation has become stronger, it's that boards of directors and members of the C-suite know that there may be some issues, but they don't know enough about it. And so we at the Forum, for example, just created in January a tool for boards of directors to actually work out what AI is and how it might impact their businesses, so that we can make sure that we grow artificial intelligence, which can help us all as humans so much and our planet, whilst also mitigating some of those problems. Whether that prediction of PwC holds true now during COVID, I think is less likely. I think that we might find that as we come out of COVID, the companies that survive are going to be companies that start using AI in some way. And then, of course, we have to think about if that's in automation of jobs, how do we use AI to reskill, and how do we think about that aspect? So wherever you are on the continuum of AI, there's something to think about and to get right so that we can benefit.
But the crucial point is just right after the pandemic period, companies are rather concerned about how to involve AI into their structure, organization, right? And how to develop some AI algorithms or organizations within their companies, or which to buy, right? So what would your recommendations would be at this very important point?
Okay, so my first recommendation would be to read the work that we just did with the UK government. So the UK government has just adopted the work that we and they did together around the procurement, so the buying of artificial intelligence by the UK government. And whilst that's not exactly the same as companies, it gives some really good guidelines to follow if you're thinking of buying AI that will hopefully keep your company out of the headlines because you got it wrong. So that's one thing. I would also suggest when you're thinking, a company is thinking of buying in or creating their own AI, that they really think very carefully about maybe appointing a chief AI ethics officer, or at least following some of the good practice around having a committee that thinks about their use of artificial intelligence. So on that, they might look, for example, to Microsoft's Ether committee. And the other piece of thought that I think is really important here is AI, because it's self-learning, is going to change at different pieces of the time that you're using it. So you really have to be aware of that. And so it's really useful to not only have your AI engineers involved right at the very beginning of an idea, but also your humanities experts and other employees, so that the whole organization is working together, thinking about the product from the moment that you have the idea about the product to the time that you sell. And if you are actually selling AI, you might actually want to think about what's happening to it and what your liability is post the sale, because we haven't worked that out internationally, and not very many countries have worked that out either.
So you are saying that from the very start, the companies need to be very much careful with their strategy. Their strategy should be solid and sound, and the company needs to have a culture from top to the top, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But this is something very difficult to do, isn't it? I mean, because dynamics are changing like every year. For example, I've been reading that the AI now in another winter process is in the winter process. I'm not sure whether it's a true concept or not, but isn't it very difficult to draw a roadmap, or is it like the governance or the state strategies are really the guidelines for the businesses?
So yes, I always say to countries, you need a national AI strategy. And I know Turkey is working on one at the moment.
Exactly.
So it's really important that countries create that national AI strategy, because what it does is that it actually helps create an AI ecosystem, because companies then know the parameters of what they're going to be doing and how the state is thinking. And that's really important to kickstart your AI economy. But also, if you're a company, you need a strategy about how you're going to use AI. And you only have to look at some of the things that have gone wrong for other companies using AI to realize that, for example, in human resources, if you're going to use AI for talent spotting, it would be a really good idea to either join the work that we're doing at the World Economic Forum on that, or wait until we produce our guidelines at the end of this year. If you're going to be using facial recognition, the EU has said that's a really high-risk use of artificial intelligence. So look at all the work we're doing work at the Forum, but there's other work being done around this. So really make sure that you're learning from the failures of others so that you don't make those same mistakes. Because one of the things that we say to boards of directors and C-suite is that these tools can go wrong on you really quickly and affect your brand value. So let me just take bias, for example. Mm-hmm. You get bias either from the people who create the algorithms, and if you're only using Turkish men to create the algorithms, you're going to have a problem there. You get it also from the way that the algorithm is designed, and also from the data. So if you are using the wrong data for your problem, you are going to end up with bias. Or if your data was biased to begin with, for example, you know, in America, we've seen that data is often biased in loans against African Americans. If your data is biased, then you're going to end up with algorithms that have been taught to have the same bias. And that's an ethical problem, but it's also a business challenge. There was a Gartner report in 2018, which actually said that 85% of all algorithms, if we didn't do something about bias, would simply give erroneous outcomes by 2022. So, you know, it's whether you call it an ethical problem or you just call it an AI problem, it's a problem that we've got to fix.
Mm-hmm. But as you say, from the ethical point of view, there is something very much contradictory to me. For example, the leading countries in the world are collaborating with international organizations about ethics and, you know, even, for example, as you're an expert of human trafficking, right? They collaborate with international organizations, that's one thing. But when it comes to their security and fight against crimes, national or international, they invest a lot on facial recognition, right? So where are we going at this part of the very ethical question?
Yes, so on facial recognition, we actually have a project which we are doing with Narita Airport and Paris Airport. And so that work is around, you know, helping with flow through the airports. So using facial recognition for flow. But even in a limited situation like that, you need to audit your algorithms. So at the moment, we're in that process of the pilot, having the algorithms that they're using audited. You have to think about how you're going to use data. Are you going to keep that data? Are you going to share it with anybody? If you're going to share it with people, who are you going to share it with? And so it is really important that it is an international collaboration. And on the law and order side of facial recognition, we're actually working both in India and with UNICRI and Europol to help think through these absolutely fundamental issues about using that technology.
Mm-hmm. So from your area of expertise, from what you say, I understand there are two topics. The AI as a solution might turn into, which actually as a prediction looks like it's going to turn into an AI question. And considering the health of the data, data is going to be always a problem. And creating bias in all terms of business life or regular citizen life, right? So what's the picture here? I mean, in the following years, where does the situation right now is taking us to?
Well, honestly believe that, and I wouldn't be doing the work if I didn't believe this, I honestly believe that AI can help us to conquer some of the big issues of the world that we need to deal with. So education for all, for example. We could educate everybody individually using AI and augmenting the human teachers. And that would mean that the world would do a lot better if everybody was educated. But before we do that, we need to make sure that we have the underpinning correct. And so that's really what we do. We think about, well, and we're doing this one with UNICEF, we think about, well, what are the rights of children? How do we empower children to use the technology? How do we protect them from the use of the technology? And for example, you know, if their toys come with facial recognition, what do we need to do around that? And what data is being stored about our kids? So we need to put in all these pieces of the puzzle, and then we can build beneficial AI for educating everybody, which is for me, the holy grail of AI. I want to, you know, extend healthcare to everybody, extend education to everybody, really sort of help humans flourish and the planet flourish using AI. But before we can do that, we have to get these bottom layers correct.
But before doing that, don't you think there is also the problem of losing jobs and the transformation of jobs? From a very realistic point of view, how do we, for example, expect a person living in far Asia transform itself? Let's take a 55-year-old truck driver. Mm-hmm. How do we expect this man with limited education opportunities or physical circumstances to transfer himself into something better according to the Industry 4.0?
Yes, absolutely. It's a huge question, and it's a question that actually my colleague Sadia leads a whole team working on at the Forum. In her most recent report, it did actually, or the team's most recent report, they did actually say that there would be more jobs created by AI than lost. But we might find that we have a sort of interim period where truck drivers, like the person you describe, are losing their job and we're not educating them for something else. And that's really takes me back to the National AI Strategy. When Turkey is writing its National AI Strategy, it needs to be thinking about reskilling, education, how you know, and a lot of education is sort of fairly monolithic. It's really difficult to change what kids learn, but we need to be doing that now so that they're trained to embrace the technology as we move forward. And then we need to think about, well, what are we going to do as a state, or maybe as a business, with the employees whose jobs change because of autonomous vehicles or AI. Mark Benioff, who's the chair of Salesforce, is on record as saying, you know, big companies like that can retrain their own people and should think of themselves as a university. And so it's a requirement, I think, on both business to think about how you could move people into different jobs, but also the government to think about the strategy. On the moving within companies, there's a really interesting startup based in Australia that looks at this person has this amount of training, this is the new job that we want, which requires this amount of training. We could just move this person, who's maybe an accountant, to be a data analyst by giving this tiny bit of training. And that's a really good way of looking at, well, let's not just make somebody redundant and then employ a data scientist. Let's try and move them within the company.
Mm, exactly, and you are a great example to this, aren't you? From law, you just turned into yourself an AI expert, right?
So, yes, I was a lawyer and then a judge for a number of years. But I had always had an interest in artificial intelligence for really the longest time. And then I guess I was fortunate to have the foresight to, back in 2012, be thinking about some of these ethical issues as we moved to much more machine learning as part of AI, where the problems are based. And I think that most of us who came into this originally came in thinking about superintelligence. So, you know, if you think of Nick Bostrom's work in 2014, Stephen Hawking saying that AI would be the best thing or the worst thing or the last thing that we ever do. And so, you know, and people are still working on superintelligence. But my area of work has really become this: we must get it right now in order to enjoy the benefits.
Okay, so my final question would be, you summed up perfectly how a national strategy would be, and the businesses can benefit from this strategy. Mm-hmm. But talking about very much particular for Turkey, what do you suggest to Turkish companies, Turkish businessmen?
I suggest that you read our national AI strategy white paper. So we have two people working on the team, one who helped create the French national AI strategy and one who helped create the India national AI strategy. So it's a good place to start thinking about the issues that your government is thinking about at the moment. Again, you know, if you're thinking of buying AI, although it's not exactly for you, the procurement work we did with the UK. Also, if you are sit on a board, then look at the board toolkit that we produced, because that will help you really think through some of these issues. And we're working on a C-suite version at the moment, but until we've got the C-suite version, I would recommend the C-suite read the boards as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today and this episode.
Thank you.
Sharing your thoughts and recommendations. Thank you so much.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
My pleasure.